Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Starr here with you, and we are going to give you a quick summary / review of Unit 2, Population and Migration. Your test is coming up on Monday. It has two parts. You're going to be looking at the 50-question multiple choice section, which is the population and migration, the main part of it, which will be its own exam. And then there will also be another exam that you'll have to do that day as well, which is just a 15-question matching section. Both of those obviously will work towards your summative score, and you'll be working on both of those Monday during your class time, right? Whether you're here or you're at home. The other portion of the exam is a take-home FRQ exam. And so you'll be working on your free response question sometime Monday, could be Tuesday, and then you need to have it turned in sometime on Tuesday. All right, so that is Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 based questions for your FRQ. And we'll talk a little bit about possibilities of that question here shortly too. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the summary and review of Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. We start by looking at our world population centers, which you just kind of saw on that map a second ago. There it is. You can see those clusters are shown here by the countries or regions looking extra large or bulgy. Those same clusters are right here. Our four major population clusters: East Asia, South Asia, Europe, and Southeast Asia. And kind of an honorable mention, we look at the New England area of the United States, the Bulwash Corridor, they call it, or the Megalopolis on the East Coast. But all of those places have some common geographic characteristics, and that is they are all located for the most part on the coast, and they all have access to water and farmland, which are very important things for humans to have. That is why we see such major population clusters in those areas. There we see them again, this time different type of map, but you can see the clusters there: East Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and then obviously Europe. And you can also see that New England megalopolis on the coast as well. We also have multiple ways to measure density and population density in the world. We have arithmetic, physiological, and agricultural. All of this you also had in your guided reading as well. We went a little bit more in depth on physiological and agricultural. Arithmetic density, though, is just basic: how many people per amount of land. All right, so the most densely populated country in the world is Monaco, and the least densely populated country in the world is Mongolia. When we look at physiological density, we're not just looking at people and land, we're looking at people and farmland. It's actually the resource we're most interested in here, the idea that how many people do we have per the amount of farmland that we have as well. And so that gets into resource allocation in countries. The last one is looking at agricultural density, and the number of farmers versus the amount of arable land in a country. And so this relationship gives us a little bit more about the productivity levels of those countries and the farmers in those countries. You want a country to have a low density. If you have a low agricultural density, that means you have greater productivity, probably access to more technology, and you're able to feed your people more productively, which means you probably have less farmers. Countries that have more farmers are probably going to have a higher agricultural density. We also got into some of the demographics, some of the specific stats as we go through and look at population. We have natural increase rate, which is just taking your crude birth rate, your crude death rate, and equaling out what your natural increase would be from there. And so you can see currently in the world, our natural increase rate is about 1.2%. Doesn't sound bad, except for when you think about that's over 7.5 billion people that we're looking at. And so that's about 80 million a year. We look at the added natural increase rate. And so over the last 12 years, we've added about 1 billion people. And we look at today, our doubling time for adding twice the population we currently have is about 58 years. And so that means in your lifetime, our population could easily be 16 billion people. All right. Most of that growth is occurring in lesser developed countries. And we talked about, and you already know this, but the idea of what stage in the demographic transition they're in, and that leads to more growth in those places. We'll get to that here shortly. The other statistics we need to look at, we already talked about crude birth rate. Total fertility rate is a big one, though. Total fertility rate is the average number of children a woman will have during her childbearing years, so 15 to 49. And so the world average is about 2.4. And you can take a look at the chart there. You can see in some regions of the world, like sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa, that number is higher than 2, where we look at in some of the more developed areas like Europe and Oceania, we see, and Latin America, we see that number is 2 or less, basically. And so that's a big difference here. All right, we'll get to that here shortly when we look more at total fertility rate. Other measurements we look at, infant mortality rate is a big one. This one really is going to measure more of the healthcare system in place in that country. And so we look at an infant mortality rate, we're looking at the number of children who die before the age of 1. And so that is looking at do they have access to healthcare, and are they able to get the needed medical treatment that they might need at that age. We also have crude death rate. Crude death rate is not a real good measurement of development. We know that because as you become more developed, as your country does, we look at higher death rates occurring. And that's because you have more elderly people in your society. People live longer in more developed countries. And as that happens, people die of old age and other things. So you have an increasing crude death rate. Then we got into the demographic transition model, and this is a big one. All right, we know that these 4 stages, and actually maybe a 5th stage we can add to the end, are influenced by culture and economics, and obviously it incorporates a lot of our demographic data here to kind of describe what has happened to populations throughout history. And so let's take a look, deep dive here into all our 4/5 stages of the DTM. In stage 1, we know that there are no countries in stage 1 today. We know that this is a low growth stage, or this is kind of Earth's early population. So hunter-gatherer societies, eventually leading to the agricultural revolution, which would lead to people settling and creating civilizations. So we see a high crude birth rate, a high crude death rate, and because of that, we don't see any real natural increase rate. It pretty much stays stagnant or at 0. All right. In stage 2, we look at high growth. And so we know that in the high growth stage here, the crude death rate drops, usually from some kind of progress that's made. So we see in the 1750s here, the Industrial Revolution occurred. And so a couple of countries and regions, Europe and the United States, entered stage 2 right around that time, right around 1800. There was higher productivity for agriculture and for food. Higher wealth was obtained during that time. And we see technologies that helped and made the production of food easier. And so at this time, we start to see the death rates drop in those places that are occurring, that are having the Industrial Revolution occur at that point. The rest of the world will reach this stage 2 right around the 1950s, and that's as a result of the medical revolution. People had better access to medicine and medical treatment around the world at that point. And so every country in the world is at stage 2 or higher at this point. All right. Then we have stage 3, which becomes kind of a moderate growth stage. We look at a drop in the crude birth rate now. And so now that the crude birth rate is starting to decline a little bit, the crude death rate is continuing to decline, our natural increase rate will now start to decline as well. That doesn't mean that our population is not growing. Our population at this point continues to grow, just not at such a massive growth rate as we saw in stage 2. It slows down a little bit. Europe and the United States entered this stage right around the early 1900s. Asia and Latin America, probably the last 30 or 40 years from now, have entered this. And then many African nations have still not entered this. Specifically, Sub-Saharan Africa, we see they are kind of stuck in stage 2. And that's where we get to the idea of how do we help them to develop beyond stage 2. Finally, we look at the stage 4, which is low growth, and our more developed countries around the world, US, Europe, Australia, have really entered kind of this stage here. And so crude birth rate, crude death rate equal out together. That means our natural increase rate is right around 0, or ZPG, zero population growth. And we get the ZPG from the total fertility rate dropping to about 2.1. And that's about replacement rate. That means that a woman has 2 children in her lifetime. She replaces her and her husband, or her and her significant other, and that then they are replaced as they die. And so that's why we get to that 2.1 replacement rate. Like I said, United States and Europe have entered this stage. A few other places, when we look at more developed countries, have entered it as well. All right. Then we get to this possible 5th stage, and we talk about negative growth. Some demographers argue that this is starting to happen, and we're starting to see it become more prevalent in certain places. Mostly Eastern European countries, we've seen this. We've seen this in even Japan as well, where the crude death rate now is exceeding the crude birth rate. More people are dying than are being born at this point. And there's definitely social and economic issues that have played into why this might be. But when we look at this, obviously it is starting to occur, and it is clearly becoming part of that demographic transition model, this stage 5 of negative growth. All right. We also added on population pyramids. And so population pyramids go right along with the stages of the demographic transition model. The population pyramid you can see here, there's 2 major factors. You have age structure and sex structure that is located right on the pyramid. It gets its shape based on the crude birth rate. And so we can kind of see, and at different stages of the demographic transition model, different looking population pyramids should start to occur. So you have that kind of basic pyramid in stage 2. You move into a little bit more like a Coke bottle almost in stage shape in stage 3. And then in stage 4, you see this, what we see in this one here, that decline at the very bottom, where you're seeing less people being born and a larger kind of middle section here. Okay. We also got into with population pyramids the idea of age structure and why that's so important. There are many countries that have started to age and get old very quickly, and that makes things very difficult. And that's because of this dependency ratio. If you have people between the ages of 0 and 14 and people at the age of 65 plus, those people are considered dependents. And that's because they typically don't work. They're not making money for themselves. And so the people between 15 and 64 are responsible for making enough money so that through social services and whatever it may be, Social Security, that people can get the money they need. Those dependents get the money they need. And so if you have too many dependents in a nation or in your country, then your workers are going to have to support a larger number than maybe the workers have, or the ability that they have to do so. And so here is that demographic transition model with a whole bunch of explanations on here, guys. You need to know the basic idea of what happens in each of these stages with the birth rate, death rate, natural increase rate. I would also make sure that you understand some of the reasons for those changes, all right, whether it's birth rate or death rate. So I would kind of study this, look this over a little bit, and make sure you prepare yourself to understand the DTM fully as we move into the test. After the DTM, we got into our old buddy Thomas Malthus here, an English economist who in the year 1798, he was living in England in stage 2 of the demographic transition model, and he saw that the population was booming. It was going crazy, and he decided that he needed to do something, and so he wrote a thesis basically talking about the fact that population will outgrow our food supply if we don't do something about it. And his proposed solution was moral restraint. In other words, stop having babies, keep your pants on. All right. So people have looked back at Thomas and said, well, maybe he wasn't completely wrong. And maybe he was just ahead of his time. Because if we fast forward to today, we are having some problems with maybe outgrowing our food supply. And so we get to people who are considered neo-Malthusians. And those neo-Malthusians believe that two major trends are happening today. We're seeing all the highest growth in populations happening in the poorest countries. And we see that there is a high dependency on resources, not just food. So maybe instead of the food aspect, we could be looking at a shortage of water or a shortage of other resources that we need to survive. And so they say the results of that is war, civil violence or civil disobedience, and conflict have led to major issues. So maybe Malthus was right, but 200 years early. We also have another camp of people who believe that, no, Malthus was dead wrong. These anti-Malthusians would say that our supply of resources is not fixed. We've been able to continue to increase it through technology and through other aspects throughout all of human history. And they believe that maybe population growth could stimulate the economic progress. Maybe it could. We could see the next Albert Einstein or Stephen Hawking born, and maybe they will have a solution to our problem. We also look at the idea of this being a human welfare issue that is caused by economics and socioeconomics. And so we get down to the idea of this: we have enough food in the world, we just don't have a way to get it to the people that always need it. So it's distribution versus supply. So you've got kind of both camps here, the Malthusians or neo-Malthusians and the anti-Malthusians. Then we got into how do we slow population growth? And so specifically those countries that are in stage 2 right now, how do we slow down the growth that they need? How do we get them to the next level where they can start to slow their growth? We need to obviously decrease the crude birth rate. And so the crude birth rate in the last 20 years has declined across the entire world, but we still need it to decline more in certain places. And so we look at those places can be influenced most by two things: economic and social development and contraception. If we can give them economic and social development and help them move beyond stage 2 of the demographic transition model and into stage 3, that should offer more educational opportunities and job opportunities for women, which means as countries become more developed, we see women getting more access to those things, which also would give them more access to contraception, which hopefully would slow down population growth. It's not a one or the other. It is both of those things: economic and social development and contraception access. All right. After the DTM, we got into this idea of the epidemiological transition. So we know what's going on with population growth. What about how are people dying in each of those stages? And that's what the epidemiological transition looks at. So in stage 1, you can see we have major like sweeping illnesses like the Black Death or the plague. And then so these large pestilence and famine that are going on. In stage 2, we had the receding pandemics, so things like cholera or malaria or tuberculosis. In stage 3 and 4, we see things that are degenerative because most people, or most countries, I should say, in stages 3 and 4 are more developed countries. And so people live longer, there's longer life expectancies, which means people die of things like heart disease and cancer versus cholera. Cholera is something that we've been able to fix most likely in more developed countries. Okay. Then we got into migration. And so we don't have a great picture of the population of a place if we also don't talk about the people that migrated or immigrated to a place as well. And so we get into some of the push and pull factors here of migration. All of them kind of are based on 3 major factors. All right, whether you decide to move to a place or you're being pushed from the place you're in or you're being pulled to a specific place because of something, it comes down to political, environmental, and economic. Political reasons are things like maybe forced migration. Maybe you're a refugee because of warfare. Maybe you're internally displaced, an IDP, internally displaced person, maybe because of environmental problems is one of the reasons why you might see that. We might see political reasons. Maybe you're being persecuted in a specific place, or maybe your religion has been persecuted. You may leave that place because of that, or maybe just in general, you're seeking asylum to try to get away from the government or something else that might be causing you to leave a country. All right, or go to another country because of the opposite, because of freedoms that you might experience in that country. We look at environmental reasons. It comes down to you might be pulled to a certain place because of desirable conditions. Maybe you want to live on the beach, or you want to live in the mountains, or maybe you just want to not have negative 20 degrees when it's January in Minnesota, right? Maybe so you want to move somewhere a little bit more desirable for climate. That would be a good pull factor to pull you to a place. An example of a push factor for environmental reasons might be like a hurricane. Like maybe your area gets hurricanes or earthquakes and a natural disaster hits and you can't afford to rebuild. And so maybe you decide it's easier for you to leave where you lived and go somewhere else. So that would push you out of a place. The example that we talked about was the Hurricane Katrina. Pushed a lot of people out of New Orleans, and most of them could not afford to come back and rebuild there. So they moved to other places in the South and stayed there. We also see economic reasons. This is the number one reason for a push or pull factor for people migrating. It is, you could question, is it voluntary? Are people looking to go somewhere else to get a new job? Maybe, but you need to have a job. If you don't have a job, you can't afford the things that you need to pay for. You can't afford to survive as a family if you don't have a way to pay for yourselves. And so economic reasons are both a push and pull factor, the number one. And we also saw the largest flows here. We looked at a lot of people coming from Asia and going to North America, a lot from Asia going to Europe, and then we see a lot of people going from Latin America to North America as well. Those are the 3 biggest flows. We've got others here that are shown on the map as well, but those 3 are currently the largest migration flows that we see in the world. You also need to know a little bit about this, guys. This is something that we struggle on. Typically, we struggle on looking at in general, but you need to know the basic eras of immigration in the United States. And so when we look at that early colonial settlement, we look at the first era. Most people are coming from Britain, or we're seeing people being forced migration from Africa, right? Slavery. We move into the second kind of phase or era here of immigration. We have European settlement. And so you need to know those specific dates too, the 40s, 50s, the 80s, the 90s, and the 80s to the 1900, the 1900 to the 20s. You need to know where those people are coming from. Yes, they're all European, but they are coming from distinct backgrounds, and their culture they bring with us is going to greatly shape the United States as well. And then we look at today, if we look at more kind of a lesser development or lesser developed country settlement, people from the 1950s to today are coming from Asia and Latin America primarily. And we're starting to see more African settlement as well, more African migration, I should say, as well. So typically, how far do people actually migrate from? So we look at when people are traveling. International migration, we tend to see more in kind of stage 2. So countries that are in that stage 2 of the DTM, people will leave. And again, it could be voluntary, it could be forced migration, but we do see a lot more international migration of countries in stage 2. People are willing to move further during that time because of the population growth. We look at largest flows of migrants today. We already kind of hit a little bit earlier on the map. And then we talk about the internal migration. This is the most common type of migration that we still see today. People moving around region to region inside a country, so intra-regional. And we see a lot of people leaving rural areas and going to more urban areas from one region to another. So a lot of people might be leaving rural areas in the northeast or in the Midwest and heading to places in the south or southwest to more urban areas. We also see intra-regional, which is within the region itself. And then we tend to see the most common intra-regional movement as people going from urban or cities into suburban areas around them. All right. Then we look at where do immigrants actually come from? Where do they settle when they get from those places, I should say. And so we talk about there really isn't a uniform distribution. It's not like everyone goes to one place or there's different spots. But we look at kind of 3 or 4 things that really kind of play into where immigrants settle. The first is proximity. We tend to see a lot of Latin American people settle in the southern United States. It's just typically where they came from. They came from that area, so they tend to settle in that area. We see a lot of people who immigrate to the United States from Asia settling on the Pacific coast. And so the same thing, all right? Not a whole lot of difference there when we look at proximity. Economics is a big one. We see that the job growth is primarily in the south and the west of the United States. So there's a lot more people that will follow or go to those places for jobs. Which kind of plays into the second one, or the third one, I should say here too, which is cities. Major cities, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. We tend to see people migrate to those places because there are more jobs available. There's also the cultural aspect. Like you can kind of see in the picture there. It's very likely if you're going to a major city that there will be other people that share your culture in that city as well. And the last one is one that they've changed the meaning of it a little bit, the idea of chain migration or family communities. And so when we look at this, it's been in the news a little bit in the last couple of years, the idea of chain migration. It's not exactly what they're in the news. They don't talk about the way we talk about it. And when we talk about chain migration, we mean that people will migrate to a certain place because they already know that there's an established family member there, or there's an established community or cultural community that they belong to. And so there are 2 really good examples of chain migration in the Twin Cities, right? St. Paul, we know, has a large Hmong population. And we know that Minneapolis has a large Somali population, and that is kind of chain migration. They know that there's other family members and there's community members or cultural members that share their culture here. So people of those cultures will come to the Twin Cities. We also got in a little bit to looking at some of the different intra-regional migration here, going a little bit more in depth on them. Rural to urban, we talked about. This was sparked after the Industrial Revolution or during the Industrial Revolution, so all the way back to the 1800s. And so in our more developed countries, people were leaving their farms, in some cases being forced from their farms, to go to the cities because, again, that's where the jobs were. So they went to the cities for jobs. We also see that today, this is where we're seeing most of the rapid growth in urban areas, is in lesser developed countries. We talk about urban to suburban. This is most common in more developed countries as well. After 1950, the suburbs started to grow very quickly, and basically it was because of lifestyle change. People decided they wanted to move out of the cities. They could afford more. They could move to the suburbs, and maybe their children can go to better schools. They could have a larger house, or maybe have a bigger backyard, whatever it may be. So it was a cultural lifestyle change for people. And then we look at there's a counter urbanization that's going on too today, and that is the idea of moving from urban areas to rural areas. We have, and this is more common in more developed countries, we have technology that allows us to still access work, still access our entertainment, whatever it may be, and communication via Wi-Fi and the internet. And so now that that's in rural areas, people have begun to do this counter-urbanization, leaving cities and suburbs to go to maybe a more quiet life in the rural areas. Okay. So ladies and gentlemen, that kind of wraps up our major just kind of summarization of everything here. Take a quick look, though, at this last slide we have. And you know that the last portion we have is going to be that take-home FRQ we have. And again, keep in mind, remember, writing FRQ, we did a little bit of practice a week or so ago. The idea of ACE IT, right, where you know the 5 action verbs and you know how to kind of answer each of the questions based on what action verb they're telling you. And we'll give you a little bit more information to help you practice that too. But you have basically 2 options for this FRQ. We will give you the FRQ. And so right here, I am telling you right now, there are 2 options for you. All right, you can read them right here. One of them deals with push and pull factors, basically, for migration. And you can see the other one looks at some of the problems between more developed countries and lesser developed countries when we look at some of the population problems they may see. So you need to study for those 2, one's from chapter 2, one's from chapter 3. Study for those 2 FRQs, and the day of the exam, we will tell you and show you which one of those FRQs you will be writing and taking home. Now, the idea is we want you to focus on creating the best free response question you can, or the answer to it. We're more focused on you learning to write them to the best of your ability. So that's what I'm saying right now. Study for both of these questions, and we will give you one of those questions then on Monday. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions about anything as we continue on, don't forget you should be doing and kind of looking at a couple things as we study through for the multiple choice section too, and for the vocab. But if you need some help studying, guys, here's some good tips. Number 1, look over if you took any notes, go back and look over those notes again, or the review notes that we do in class. You can go back and look at the PowerPoints and help yourself kind of refresh those things. Definitely read back through your guided readings. We have gone through painstaking process over the last couple of years to make sure that our guided readings fit alongside of our test questions for the most part. So go back and check your guided readings, read through them. You could obviously complete your study guide, which you should do. And if you need to do a retake, you will have to have a completed study guide as well. And then if you feel like you need a little bit more, guys, go back and read chapter 2 and chapter 3. I know there's some reason there, but you can definitely go back and read them, or you can kind of hit your main highlights in each of them. But definitely go back and look at those things to help you out. And then finally, make sure you study your vocabulary. All right. If you need anything over the next couple of days, guys, you can contact Mr. Sheridan, or you can contact me, Mr. Starr, to help you out if you have any questions as you get ready for your Unit 2 Population and Migration exam. Good luck, guys, and we'll see you again soon.